It was the strangest of sights. Two odd-looking vessels dueling, often at point-blank range, in the waters of Hampton Roads. One ship was called a floating barn by one observer, the other described as a tin can on a shingle. Both vessels looked nothing like the tall, elegant sailing ships of the day, and neither seemed much like the other. Yet, dissimilar though they were, the two ships shared important characteristics. Both were shielded by armor, clad in iron by metal plates that deflected the fire of enemy cannon. They represented a new approach to naval warfare, a new invincibility, and a new era. As their shots rang out, they signaled not only combat, but the end of the age of wooden fighting ships and the beginning of the age of iron. The battle the two ships fought that March day in 1862 was only one of many naval engagements in the Civil War. In an immediate sense, the cause for the construction and deployment of ironclads lay in that struggle. Recognizing that the Southern economy was highly dependent on exports for revenues and on imports for supplies, Union strategists sent their small but superior navy to disrupt Southern shipping by attempting a blockade of Confederate ports.
The strategy of the blockade was essentially to isolate the South economically and militarily, to give the federal forces a baseline for combined operations from seaports that were held into the interior of the South, and also, in effect, to draw a cordon sanitaire through which neutrals could not project either their own warships or indeed ships constructed by the Confederacy in their British or French building yards.
Another one named Williamson.
Confederate leaders, too, recognized their predicament and turned to ironclads as an innovation that would threaten the Union Navy of wooden ships, destroy the blockade, and eliminate the Northern naval edge.
They had this huge hulk left over after the burning of the Merrimac at the Norfolk Navy Yard. Its machinery was reasonably intact. They knew they wanted to break the blockade of Hampton Roads. They didn't have conventional weapons or warships with which to do it. And the notion of an ironclad was sort of applying materials at hand to the problem at hand.
An important influence was Confederate Navy Secretary Stephen Mallory, who was a United States Senator before the war and who had chaired the Senate's Naval Affairs Committee. There he had learned of the early French success with armor plating.
He was very much aware of European developments, and Mallory faced a serious problem. The Union had a navy. The Confederate States didn't. So Mallory was faced with the task of building a navy, and if he was going to be effective at it, each one of his ships had to be able to take on 3, 4, or 5, whatever, Union ships. So Mallory from the outset wanted armor. He knew that armor could sink the wooden ships of the United States Navy. He knew that armor could raise a blockade if necessary and if they were opposing wooden ships. And he also knew the North was going to invest in armor vessels.
In the Crimean War, the French had deployed 3 floating ironclad batteries and forced the surrender of a Russian fort on the Black Sea. After the Crimean War, other innovations, such as steam engines and screw propellers, were increasingly incorporated in warship design. The French built the steam frigate La Gloire, an ironclad wooden ship. The British constructed the steam frigate Warrior, one of the first iron-hulled armored ships. Soon, ironclads were in development in many countries in Europe, but they remained untested in battle. These ironclads were developed in response to improvements in naval artillery technology. Powerful new cannon used larger powder charges to fire exploding shells and solid shot, causing extensive damage to wooden ships. Shielding ships in iron was a technological reaction to the improved cannon.
Ironclads were a reaction to the introduction to rifled guns. The The innovation of a powerful gun that could fire a shell at a wooden ship needed some sort of defensive reaction. Now, what a shell fired from a powerful rifled gun would do, even at long range, is penetrate the wooden ship and set it on fire. So in order to counter that, some sort of armor was necessary.
Because the South had a limited industrial capacity, Mallory and others recognized that starting construction of an ironclad from the keel up would be a time-consuming use of limited resources. An opportunity for a significant shortcut was presented when Union forces abandoned the Gosport Navy Yard at Portsmouth, Virginia in April 1861. Although the fleeing Northern forces had tried to burn everything, substantial stores of weapons, ammunition, and supplies were recovered by the Confederates. Also, there were the remains of the USS Merrimac, a Union steam frigate burned and sunk by the Federals to keep it from falling into Southern hands. On May 30th, 1861, the charred vessel was raised and work began to convert her. The hull was cut down to the waterline, leaving the ship with a deep 22-foot draft. The ship's engines were overhauled, a gun deck constructed, and a casement built with sloping sides to deflect enemy cannon fire. The heavy 24-inch thick wooden casement was armored with 2 layers of iron plates, each 2 inches thick, extended 2 feet below the waterline to protect against ramming and low shots.
This is a piece of armor plate from the CSS Virginia, or more popularly known as the Merrimac. It's 2 inches wide, 8 inches long, and the Virginia had 2 layers of this armor plate, one running horizontally and the other one running vertically. And in back of the armor plate there was up to 48 inches of oak, and that gave her a tremendous amount of protection from enemy shot and shell.
10 cannon were installed in the casement, and a cast iron ram was placed on her prow. On February 17, 1862, after delays in manufacturing the needed iron plating, the ship was commissioned the CSS Virginia, a name forgotten by many who continued to call the ship by her popular name, Merrimac. Command was given to Commodore Franklin Buchanan. One of the most distinguished officers in the United States Navy, Buchanan was a founder of the U.S. Naval Academy and its first superintendent. When Southern states seceded, he resigned his commission and joined the Confederate cause as commander of the James River Fleet. For his flagship, he chose the Merrimac. A crew was recruited and supplies taken on board. Finally, what was intended to be a trial run was made on March 8th. The Merrimac was slow and awkward. Her worn-out engines were further damaged by weeks of submersion, and it took half an hour to turn the ship around. The notoriously aggressive Buchanan made directly for the Union fleet at Newport News. As spectators watched in disbelief, the Merrimac steamed toward the Union 30-gun sailing frigate Cumberland, firing a devastating broadside into the 50-gun sailing frigate Congress along the way. The Merrimac then rammed the starboard bow of the Cumberland. The ironclad was at first tangled in the Cumberland, but then pulled free after her ram broke off. One officer said the hole caused was wide enough to drive in a horse and cart. She sank to the bottom, her masts thrust above the waves like tombstones. Buchanan turned the Merrimac and made for the Congress. Seeking refuge from the deep-drafted Merrimac, the Congress was towed into shoals and ran aground. Unable to maneuver, the Congress was an easy target for the Merrimac and other Confederate gunboats. Soon, an observer on a nearby ship reported, the decks of the Congress flowed with blood like water on a wash deck morning. The ship ran up the white flag of surrender. But Union batteries on shore refused to abide by the surrender of the Congress. When 2 Confederate ships pulled alongside her to take prisoners and wounded on board, the batteries continued firing, wounding several. Buchanan, commander of the Merrimac, was so enraged by the breach of military etiquette that he exposed himself to enemy fire on top of the Merrimac in a fit of anger and was wounded by an enemy sharpshooter. He ordered the firing of hot shot, cannonballs heated red hot, and soon the Congress was in flames. The Minnesota, a 40-gun Union steam frigate, had also run aground and lay waiting as an inviting target. But with nightfall approaching and the tide ebbing, the new commander of the Merrimac, Lieutenant Catesby Jones, ordered the vessel retired for the night. Her crew looked forward to completing the destruction of the Union fleet the following day.
Blockade of Hampton Roads.
Those victories never came. Later that evening, a strange-looking vessel bearing a Union flag arrived in Hampton Roads.
Well, the next day, in one of history's happy coincidences, the Monitor literally showed up just in the nick of time. The vessel had been completed as a rush job up north, was towed south, almost sank while being towed south because it was not a very seaworthy vessel. And indeed, none of the Monitors were very seaworthy vessels. They were best in rivers and harbors. It only arrived late at night on March 8th to see in the distance the flames of the Cumberland and the Congress. Well, the next morning, the Virginia, coming back out, suddenly saw this thing that so many people described as a cheese box on a raft.
The ship, which had a far more revolutionary design than the Merrimac, was the brainchild of a remarkable Swedish inventor, John Ericsson. A successful engineer whose earlier work included steam engines, ships, and a screw propeller, Ericsson was on poor terms with the United States Navy when the Civil War broke out. 20 years earlier, on a trial cruise of the Princeton, a ship he designed, a 12-inch cannon called the Peacemaker exploded, killing 6 people, including 2 members of then-President John Tyler's cabinet. Ericsson was blamed for the incident. Unfairly, most people later felt, and his relationship with the Navy soured. But in 1861, events conspired to bring Ericsson and the Navy together again. Prompted in part by rumors of the conversion of the Merrimac, the Navy solicited proposals to build ironclads and appointed a so-called ironclad board of 3 members to review proposed designs. The first vessel selected by the board was the Galena, proposed by Cornelius Bushnell, a prominent Connecticut industrialist. After winning a contract, Bushnell went to New York and asked Ericsson to review the design of the Galena. Ericsson gave his assistance and then showed Bushnell a dust-covered model for an ironclad that he had submitted to Napoleon III of France in 1854. Ericsson explained the vessel's capabilities and assured Bushnell it could be built in 90 days. Bushnell was impressed and offered to present the design to the ironclad board. Bushnell even used his influence to make a personal presentation to President Lincoln. The president is said to have replied, "All I have to say is what the girl said when she put her foot into the stocking. It strikes me that there's something in it." Bushnell presented the plan to the ironclad board. After hours of discussion, the board declared that it was opposed to the design. Undaunted, Bushnell returned to New York and misled Ericsson into believing that the contract was won if only he would explain a few design details.
So Ericsson is flattered because Ericsson is a great egotist. He thinks very highly of himself with some reasons. So he goes down with Bushnell to attend this meeting, which he thinks that the entire board, composed of 3 commanders, or 3 individuals, 3 naval officers, is going to be very pleased with him and just have 1 or 2 minor questions. He walks into the room and realizes they can't understand why he's there because they've already rejected his proposal. So Ericsson gets upset, and then he begins to talk. And by the time he finishes his presentation, he ends up saying to the board, "It is not only important that you do this, it is your patriotic duty." And he convinced them. And that's how the Monitor even came to exist. It was not a straight-out contract. It was a rather twisted tale of politics, intrigue, and outright misrepresentation.
The ship was to be built in 100 days at a cost of $275,000. The final 25% of the payment was to be withheld until the ship had proven herself in combat. Erickson returned to New York and went to work. He and his draftsman, Charles McCord, began producing the many drawings required by the novel vessel. Relying on years of experience, Erickson made all of the design specifications for components required during the brief construction of the Monitor. There were delays, but work at the Continental Iron Works in Brooklyn progressed rapidly, and the vessel began to take shape. The ship was 173 feet long and little more than 41 feet wide. Her flat-bottomed iron hull had a draft of 10 feet with the heavy turret on board. The turret, the most revolutionary feature of the ship, weighed 120 tons. 9 feet high, with an interior diameter of 20 feet, the turret was turned by 2 steam engines and was able to rotate at 2.5 turns a minute. 2 11-inch Dahlgren cannon, smooth-bore muzzle-loading guns, were installed behind port shutters weighing 9 tons each and called stoppers. It took several minutes to fire and reload the guns.
The turret weighs approximately 120 tons, and it's suspended on a center column that goes down through the deck and rests on a bearing on the bottom of the ship. When they're ready to go into battle, the crew drives a large wedge under the center column, which lifts the turret approximately 1/2 inch off the deck, and so that it's free to rotate and is suspended only in the center bearing on the middle of the deck. So the whole weight of the turret is supported by one bearing at the bottom of the ship. Of course, a large object like this can't be operated by hand, so there are 2 steam engines down below, which are operated by the control officer in the turret through a series of screws and levers that go down through the center column. The guns are resting on slides on wheeled trucks, and these guns are pulled into battery by the crew, and the friction gear restrains them, is locked down, the gun's fired, and the energy of the recoil is dissipated through this friction mechanism.
As construction neared completion, Erickson proposed a name for the vessel to suggest the aggressive vigilance he foresaw the ship as providing. He called her the Monitor. On March 2nd, Erickson submitted his final certificate of construction to the Navy. Building the Monitor took 120 days. Command was given to Lieutenant John Warden. After correcting several minor deficiencies, the Monitor departed under tow for Hampton Roads on March 6th. On the morning of March 9th, the Merrimac steamed directly toward the Minnesota, her officers and crew confident of further victories. Confederate spectators watched from shore. They were delighted by the previous day's victories, and some even took to boats to watch the destruction of the remaining Union fleet. But as the Merrimac approached the Minnesota, a strange-looking object appeared. One observer thought the contraption to be a water tank or boiler being towed from the Minnesota. But the officers of the Merrimac quickly recognized that it was the Monitor. Lieutenant Jones, commander of the Merrimac, remarked of the opponent's arrival, "She could not possibly have made her appearance at a more inopportune time for us." The Merrimac fired her first shot a little after 8 a.m. It flew past the Monitor and struck the Minnesota, which answered with a broadside. When the Ironclads came into close range, the Merrimac fired a broadside into the Monitor. To the crew of the Monitor, the noise of the cannon fire was deafening, but also a relief. The cannon fire from the Merrimac was being deflected. Erickson's claim of ironclad invincibility was proving out. The ships dueled for the next 4 hours. They fired as furiously as they could from distances varying from hundreds of yards to point-blank range. Though each vessel had strengths, neither could win a decided advantage. The relatively quick and mobile Monitor outmaneuvered the Merrimac, but could not do sufficient damage to the Confederate ship. The operation of the Monitor's turret also created problems. Once started turning, it was difficult to stop with precision. Able to see out only around the edges of the gun ports, the crew often fired while the turret was still revolving. The fact that the pilot house was forward in the bow of the vessel only worsened the crew's predicament.
The vessel during the battle was steered from the pilot house. And in the pilot house was the helmsman and the captain and the pilot. This pilot house was located up forward to give the captain a good view of the enemy and the battleground. However, it did have some disadvantages because it prevented the turret from being fired straight ahead, and it also was a long distance from the turret. During the battle with the Merrimac, the voice tube communication broke down, so the commands had to be handled orally by shouting.
The Merrimac had a considerable advantage in firepower, being able to fire its more numerous cannon faster than the Monitors. However, she was slow and more cumbersome than the Union vessel. At one point, the deep draft of the Merrimac almost brought her to disaster. She ran aground. The Monitor closed in, repeatedly firing into the vessel as she desperately tried to pull free. Finally, the Merrimac freed herself and the battle resumed. The ships continued firing, and each attempted to ram the other without effect. Finally, the Merrimac got off the most effective single shot of the fight. A cannon fired into the Monitor's pilot house from about 10 yards away. The ship's captain, John Warden, was squinting through a slit in the pilot house and was partially blinded and badly wounded in the face by the blast.
When that happened, he was wounded severely. Dana Green was called to come out of the turret to take command. Well, it took about 20 minutes to get Warden back down to the wardroom where the doctor could look after him, for Green to gain effective control of the Monitor. And the Monitor drifts away from the Virginia at this point in time. Jones sees the Monitor drifting away. He says, "Hey guys, we've won." The pilots are telling him he's got to go home. Before he turns around and goes home, he'd really like to blow up the Minnesota. But the tide's going out, the Virginia draws 22 feet of water. She was aground for at least 30 minutes during the battle and was lucky to get off. So she's leaking, her stack's blown away. So she decides, under Jones's decision, he decides to return to Gosport. And as the Virginia begins her slow turn, the Monitor comes back under control. And they held a hurried council of war on board the Monitor, the officers did, and they decided to continue the fight. And that had been Warden's request to them. As they get back under control and start heading to the Virginia's turning around. So the Monitor says, "Oh, she's leaving. She's running away. We won." And the Virginia, of course, thought the exact opposite. So both sides claimed victory in an engagement that will echo through the annals of history because it was the very first time iron fought iron.
The question of who won the fight remained unanswered and is debated to this day.
Neither ship inflicted much damage on the other. They fought for 4 hours, and both returned to their bases of operation. The Monitor did succeed, however, in deterring the Merrimac from continuing its operations against the Union fleet. However, the presence of the Merrimac did delay the operations up the James River and seriously affected McClellan's campaign in the peninsula.
Oh, yeah, yeah. If you look at the Battle of Hampton Roads, both days, from a tactical point of view, the Minnesota wasn't sunk on March 9th, which meant tactically the Monitor had done what it was supposed to do. Strategically, it was an overwhelming victory for the Confederates. You know, the fact that they had broken the blockade of Hampton Roads, it was extremely significant, and of course ultimately destroyed the Peninsula Campaign.
The battle between the Monitor and the Merrimac, Virginia, was a draw, tactically. It cast an unfortunate pall on the prospects of General McClellan for the remainder of his venture against Richmond, because although the Virginia was not destroyed, she remained a threat throughout the spring of 1862, denied McClellan the opportunity to use the James River, the most favorable route of approach to Richmond, and persuaded him within a month to gamble on the York River approach, which took him fairly shortly into a relatively marshy line of approach.
It's a case of both parties winning, in a way. Tactically, or let us say strategically, the Monitor clearly won because its strategic objective was to protect the Minnesota, which it did. It kept the Virginia occupied for 4 or 5 hours, and the Virginia never really had a chance to fire a shot at the Minnesota. The Minnesota, fortunately, eventually ungrounded herself and came out of the battle virtually unscathed. Tactically, it was probably a draw. Neither ship seriously damaged the other. Both were capable of coming out and fighting again the next day, had they so wished.
In the end, the two ships never met again. The Monitor was kept in reserve to protect the Federal fleet at Hampton Roads and discourage any Southern attempt to break the blockade. The Merrimac attempted to draw the Monitor into battle, but was unsuccessful. Union commanders were under strict orders to preserve the Monitor as a defensive weapon. One Merrimac officer derided the Monitor's refusal to fight as the most cowardly exhibition I have ever seen. Neither ship survived the year. In May, the Confederates evacuated Norfolk, and the Merrimac was once again scuttled and burned, this time to keep her from falling into Northern hands. The Monitor remained with the Union fleet at Hampton Roads, settling into the often boring routine of blockade vessels. For her crew, boredom was compounded by the conditions on the ship. Heat was fierce below the deck. The ship's paymaster, William Keeler, wrote to his wife that temperatures were often in excess of 100 degrees. Along with the heat, fires, smoke, and illuminating lamps created a nightmarish atmosphere. On the last day of 1862, the Monitor was lost in a gale off Cape Hatteras, North Carolina, on her way south to join a Union blockading squadron at Charleston. The advent of the Monitor and the Merrimac signaled the arrival of iron ships of war, and both North and South began to build new iron ships. The Union, in particular, with its superior industrial strength, was able to commission a fleet of some 30 Monitors by the war's conclusion. The South's ironclad fleet was much smaller and similar to the design of the Merrimac. Though the ironclads did often play important roles in battles, their influence was not as immediately dramatic as many had predicted. Wooden ships still carried the day, largely because of their superior range and seaworthiness. But the age of iron ships had begun, and in the years to follow, navies would increasingly employ innovations used in those first ironclads as wooden warships vanished. The screw propeller, rotating gun turrets, and armor plating were but a few of the innovations that can be traced to those earliest American ironclads, the Monitor and the Merrimac. In 1973, after careful research, the Monitor was found off Cape Hatteras in 220 feet of water. Upside down and badly damaged, the ship is largely intact, although the forward half of the hull has collapsed. The damage is thought to be the result of depth charging by United States ships during World War II. The Monitor's hull, it's thought, may have been mistaken for a submarine by sonar. These images of the Monitor are the results of the continuing research at the site. In recognition of the special importance of the Monitor, the site of her wreck has been designated as the first national marine sanctuary in the United States and as a National Historic Landmark. Her anchor, a lantern, and other artifacts have been recovered, and are on display at the Mariners Museum in Newport News, Virginia. Ed Miller, who began his research on the Monitor while still a midshipman at the Naval Academy at Annapolis, works on the site for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration. His agency and the National Foundation for Maritime Conservation are working to preserve the site.
The objective of the Monitor project is the definitive documentation of the Monitor, both historically and archaeologically. And we hope that by doing that, that it will result in museum displays of artifacts, perhaps some structure of the Monitor, perhaps the entire wreck, so that
Through continued research at this memorial, more about the Monitor and her fate will be learned. Someday, the Monitor may even be brought to the surface, if not to ride the waves, at least to stand as a monument to the American ingenuity she reflects.